Hello and welcome to the People, Place and Nature podcast. During this series, we really try to focus on the more positive stories to explain the solutions and opportunities that lay before us. But sometimes it's really hard, especially when certain topics come up which are hugely important but incredibly concerning. Today, we're going to be talking about one of those, as we'll be talking with Dave Goulson about his new book, Silent Earth. This book was really interesting and quite shocking as it explains the vast decline in insect populations and the impact pesticides are having on not just them, but our health as well. As always, there is of course hope, and we do talk about some of the solutions and opportunities there are, but there are some really significant issues insects are facing across the world. It's important to remember that sustainability doesn't just relate to the environment, it relates to your finances as well. That's why we switched to Beans Accountants. Beans operate on a package system, so you always know where you stand. We halved our accountancy costs when we moved to them, and one of our associates moved to them as well and reduced theirs by 2/3. With free tax advice, accountancy support, and everything else they offer, you can't go wrong. So make sure you check out Beans Accountants in the description below, and I really hope you enjoy this episode. Hi there, Dave. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really pleased you could make it and find time for us because I've been reading your amazing book, Silent Earth, which I've filled with sticky notes. And this book really surprised me because, for one, it's all about insects. So it's Silent Earth, averting the insect apocalypse. So I did think it may have something to do with insects when I picked it up. Yeah. Exactly. But the more I read through it, the more surprised I was because it raised so many issues that I wasn't aware of, especially around pesticides and things and some of the solutions and challenges associated with that. And then your background I found incredibly interesting as well, and some of the work you've done, because you really are an incredible authority in the insect world. I mean, I might like to admit it, but you know, reading up on you, you published over 400 scientific articles on ecology and insects, which I found really incredible. It's a huge
Nobody's
number.
read most of them, it must be said. But,
and then you did some other amazing things, like you founded the Bumblebee Conservation Trust and the president of the Pesticide Free Scotland organisation.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how the latter came about. But yeah, I mean, I've just been interested in insects forever. I mean, literally when I was 5 or 6 years old, I got into the habit of searching for caterpillars in my lunchtimes at school, primary school, and taking them home in my lunchbox and trying to rear them up. And I thought it was, you know, when I didn't kill them, which was most of the time, and they turn into some beautiful moth or butterfly, I just thought that was kind of like magic, and been hooked really ever since, and been really lucky, you know. I mean, how many people get to pursue and are paid to pursue their childhood hobby, you know, through their lives. So I've spent, I guess, 35 years now employed doing research on insects. I started out with butterflies and moths, as I say, but I then kind of changed direction about 30 years ago and focused on bees, which are actually much more interesting than butterflies. You know, they're really clever. They have this amazing navigational and learning abilities and complicated social lives, and they're probably, don't want to upset any butterfly fanatics, but probably more important ecologically and economically because we do depend on them for pollination. And yeah, I've been, and through the bees, I guess I became drawn into the murky world of pesticide research because it became clear that one of the likely drivers of bee declines was pesticides. And so my research group, relatively recently, actually, I mean, this is not much more than a decade ago, we sort of, some of us started focusing on trying to understand the impacts that pesticides used in farming have on bees and other wildlife. And yeah, I mean, it's just not good, actually. I guess I was quite naive when I first went into that area. I didn't realize, I'd never worked on anything controversial before. You know, most of my research had been on how they choose which flowers to visit, and then we did a little bit of work on how to make farmland more bee friendly in terms of putting in more flowers. And you know, nobody objects if you say we should grow more flowers. But if you start saying we should use fewer pesticides, or some of the pesticides we use are harmful, it's amazing how you come under fire from this huge powerful industry that wants to carry on doing what it's been doing, despite the environmental harm it's causing. So I kind of got drawn into campaigning, and hence the president of Pesticide Free Scotland, and I'm an ambassador for the wildlife trusts, and I guess compared to most academics, I do a lot more sort of outreach, including writing the books, of course, which is my attempt to reach out to a bigger audience, I suppose.
Yeah, that's it. And I mean, I think also you've written quite a few books. So this is the 7th book you've written.
I may have mined the insect book vein as pretty much as far as you can go now. Yeah. But actually, I mean, Silent Earth really, although it's nominally about insects, it is about insects, but pretty much the issues that come up, it encapsulates the bigger kind of environmental problems that we face. The drivers of insect declines are pretty much the same, actually, as the drivers of biodiversity decline generally. And it's all interwoven with the climate crisis as well. I think the most recent book, anyway, Silent Earth, is
hold it up for everyone to see.
is the hardest hitting of the books I've written. I actually recently someone tweeted me and said, I've just read all of your books in chronological order. And I'm a bit worried about you because the first one is really cheerful, and Sting in the Tail is just about the lives of bumblebees. I don't think the word pesticide is mentioned anywhere, and it doesn't talk too much about their declines. Whereas the most recent, and there's this sort of sequence of each one slightly darker than the last books, culminating here. I don't think I can go any further down that line.
It's too depressing. Right.
Yeah, and perhaps there's not that much more I can say beyond.
Well, yeah, the trouble is we know what the situation is, we know the problems, and we also have the solutions. It's kind of just a case of trying to make people aware of that and trying to actually act on it is the big thing, isn't it? Trying to get people to make those changes and those shifts, which is what I found interesting in here, because you do talk about some of the solutions to these problems, but also you establish quite clearly the range of issues facing the natural world, and there's some really interesting statistics that come up in here when we come to pesticides, but I thought we'd talk a bit about some of the broader issue facing insects first. So for example, here you mention it's likely that insects have declined in abundance by 75% or more since I was 5 years old, which is unbelievable.
It's pretty terrifying, isn't it? And I don't think any of us completely realise or can properly appreciate the scale of the loss that we've already seen. And I mean, I guess what's most terrifying is this has happened in my lifetime. That and I should say, actually, before I ramble on further, that there are so many knowledge gaps because most insects aren't being counted by anybody. Most groups of insects and most regions of the world don't have anybody systematically monitoring insect populations. But where we do have data, it's all incredibly depressing.
Yeah.
And we have really good data for butterflies, for example, which in the UK are down about 50% since 1976, which is when records started. And actually, so I was 11 in 1976 and was, already interested in butterflies. So I grew up in a world with twice as many butterflies as the one my kids are growing up in, which is a pretty sad thought, really. And it obviously raises the question, what will my grandchildren experience? How will there be any butterflies at all by then? But there's another interesting aspect of all of this, which I think people rarely think about, which is that the data we do have for any kind of wildlife numbers, nothing goes back beyond the late 60s, and almost everything started in the 70s and 80s or later. And everything shows decline. Birds have undergone huge declines, for example, and they probably the group that we have the best data for. But it's not that these declines would have started in 1976 or whatever. We know that the drivers of them, things like habitat loss and the industrialization of farming, it started way, way before that. Fertilizers started being widely used pretty near the beginning of the 20th century, so 50 years before any data begins. And there are some sort of really interesting old kind of anecdotal records suggesting that wildlife used to be much more common than anyone alive has ever experienced. And you know, it's possible that insects have declined by much more than 75% in the last 100 years, but we just don't have any data.
Well, that's it. I mean, this is all about shifting baselines, isn't it? You know, you only know what you know. You can't have experienced what your grandparents or their grandparents experienced. I mean, I remember, for me, it's even I'm 29. In my lifetime, it's quite shocking. I remember as a child running through my grandparents' garden in Hampshire, and there'd be bees all in the grass, all of this kind of thing. Now there's none. And my grandfather, who lives on the edge of a huge nature reserve, lots of big lakes out the back and woodland. Big garden, loads of flowers, loads of vegetables, quite a diverse mix of plants. He said to me this year, he said, every year we get hornets, this year there's none. And he said, I've only seen 2 butterflies. And normally, I remember as kids, we used to chase the butterflies around with nets, you know.
Yeah.
And that's changed drastically in the last 10, 20 years. And that's the same story I'm hearing from a lot of people I'm talking to that are my age. They remember, you know, big flocks of birds. They don't see them anymore.
It's worrying that you can, someone as young as you, from my perspective, has detected that. Although it is a bit slippery, isn't it? Because
it is.
It's very hard, you know, perhaps we remember the days when there were most butterflies about more than the ones when there weren't any. And, you know, perhaps that's why we always think it was sunny when we were a kid. It's really difficult, you know, without hard data to actually...
It's like the whole wagon wheel thing, isn't it? Where, you know, everyone remembers wagon wheels being huge. And now everyone remembers them being really small. And actually, you know, the wagon wheel keeps saying, no, you're just getting bigger, and you remember them being really big. But I'm convinced they are getting smaller, so...
Yeah, well, I don't know about the wagon wheels, but the insects are certainly getting fewer, sadly.
And there's a point in here that really caught me on this exact topic, really, where you've got, it's quite a long point, but, well, various points that I'm sort of stitching together. So a recent landmark paper by Israeli scientist Yinon Baron estimated that since the rise of human civilization 10,000 years ago, wild mammal biomass has fallen by 83%. Which is roughly 1 in every 6 animals has died.
5 in 6 has died.
Oh, sorry, 5 out of 6, sorry, yeah, gosh, 5 out of 6. The scale of human impact is also revealed by this jaw-dropping estimate that wild animals now comprise only 4% of all mammalian biomass, with our livestock, mainly cows, pigs and sheep, comprising 60%, and humans making up the remaining 36%.
Oh, no, it's terrifying, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
It's that's a real jaw-dropper of a statistic to think that, you know, the whole of everything from rats and rabbits and deer to elephants and whales, you know, if you stuck them on a scale somehow, it comprise just 4% of all the mammals on the planet. You know, I mean, it just illustrates that, I guess, the scale of human influence. The degree to which we've taken over and are using all of the planet's resources for ourselves or for our livestock.
That's it. When you see it with poultry, so it says here, you know, 70% of global bird biomass is now comprised of domestic poultry.
Yeah, chickens, basically.
Chickens, yeah.
It's a lot of chickens.
That's it. In between 1970 and 2014, the total population of wild vertebrates, fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals and birds fell by 60%.
Yeah.
Which is crazy. So within living memory, more than half of our vertebrate wildlife has been lost.
Yeah, it's terrifying.
It is.
And, you know, there's no sign that this is stopping. We've done nothing to, in fact, it's probably accelerating. So, you know, we know, I mean, we estimate that there's a species going extinct on average about once an hour somewhere on the planet. You know, while we're chatting here, something somewhere will disappear. Probably an insect, because they comprise the majority of known species. But isn't that sad? You know, we live on this amazingly beautiful planet with this incredible diversity of creatures, many of which we haven't even discovered yet. You know, that we discover new insects all the time.
This is what's so tragic about it as well, because there's this huge loss of knowledge. I've been watching a program called Evolve on Amazon. I don't know if you've heard of it.
I've not seen it.
Basically, it's about biomimicry, where they're looking at various insects and animals and plants to understand. Basically, the premise is the natural world has been doing R&D for millennia, resolving all the challenges that we face. they've all already been solved in the natural kingdom. How do we look at nature to basically have a shortcut in resolving these issues? And a lot of the species they're looking at are insects. So, for example, they found scorpion venom can penetrate the blood. There's one type of scorpion where its venom can penetrate the blood, the brain barrier, I forgot what it's called, the membrane in your brain that stops viruses and things. And it has a unique property that they can use to highlight cancers in the brain for super focused treatments. And it's game changing in terms of brain cancers. And I remember a long time ago looking at, you may have seen these hydrophobic coatings you get on sort of cars and your phone and clothing where the water beads and runs off. That's designed based on the structure of a butterfly's wing, because it has this incredibly, because that's why butterflies can fly in the rain, basically. It's because of this special structure. Exactly. So there's all these amazing things, and some insects, you'll probably know the name. I used to know the name of it. It's the one that sits in the Sahara and catches the dew on its shell, and it runs it down to its mouth.
They're beetles, darkling beetles.
Yes.
Yeah,
and they found that the reason that's so effective is it has a very specific ripple structure within the, is it chitin of the beetle?
Yeah, the shell, basically.
The shell, basically, yeah. And now they're looking to use that to create basically dew harvesting systems in the desert to deal with water shortage issues, because it's zero energy, that you can just capture this structure. So that's what, because often when we talk about the loss of knowledge and the loss of medicine, we talk about plants, but actually insects have got this really massive value that is just being lost.
There are many more of them, millions of species out there. We've named 1.1 million species, and it's estimated there's maybe 3, 4, 5 million more. But even the ones we've put a name to, we haven't studied. We've no idea what amazing sort of biochemistry they might have, what molecules they might contain, or other structures. It's really interesting. I didn't know about the beetles and the butterflies, but kind of cool, isn't it? But as you say, we're losing that and we're losing species before we can discover them. So we will never even know they existed, which does seem particularly kind of poignant, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a real shame. I mean, there's some other really interesting, ways that I think it affects people that we don't realise. So one of the other striking things that caught me was a study of photographs by trophy fishermen in Key West, Florida. So this was looking at photos of catches from 1950 to 2007, which has estimated the average size of fish caught fell from 19.9 kilos to 2.3 kilos. So that just demonstrates the impact on the size of fish. Okay, that's not to do with insects, but it gives a really good example of that shifting baseline. That fishermen are just as happy to catch a 2.3 kilo fish as they were to catch these giant ones all that time ago. But no one remembers catching those giant ones all that time ago. So it's to them it's a big fish.
And that's this line at the end, near the end of that paper, that says, although the fish have got much, much smaller, the smiles on the faces of the fishermen haven't changed at all. And these old photographs show these, fishermen over the years all beaming next to their catch. Obviously, if they had the more recent ones with these tiddly little fish, if they had any idea that decades earlier people were catching things like this, they would probably be deeply disappointed, but they don't know.
That's it. The trouble is, what people don't know, they don't protect. They don't realise things are in the situation that they necessarily are.
And I mean, I guess that brings us to a slightly different issue, but we're an increasingly urban species. So most people grow up in environments where they don't encounter nature of any type very much at all. And so they don't know about it. You can't love something that you're unaware of it really exists, that you never encounter. So they're not going to care. If they hear that bees are going extinct or whatever it might be, it's just an abstract concept, because they don't, they've never really interacted with them. They've probably seen them on television at most. And so it's a real obstacle to getting people on board to tackling these problems. They're unfamiliar. In fact, many people are terrified of insects because they're not used to them, and anything buzzes near them, their first reaction is to try and kill the poor thing, which is kind of nuts. And I mean, my mission in life is to try and get people to love insects, but it's an uphill battle with most people, sadly.
So, which brings me on to another really good point in here about how insects are valued in different cultures. So in our culture, we have this real aversion to insects now, as you say, because we're very urban. Children are not as engaged with the natural world as they were before. So here it says roughly 80% of the world's population regularly consume insects, which is the complete opposite. People. That's one of the things that I find really surprising is that how many people actually eat insects. Yet here it's completely unheard of, considered disgusting. I mean, I've eaten insects before. Been to some events where I've had them, and it's fine. You just get over it, don't you? But then I spent a lot of time in the woods as a child, so this sort of thing never really bothered me too much. And it says here the practice is very common in South America, Africa, and Asia, especially with indigenous peoples in Oceania. And approximately 2,000 different insect species are regularly eaten by people. Which is
they're really nutritious. I mean, it's very odd how we came to not eat them. It doesn't make any real sense. And yet we'll happily wolf down a shrimp, which is related. They're arthropods. They've got exoskeletons. They've got lots of legs, and why do we find that tasty? Whereas a locust, which is pretty similar, really, most people would look in absolute horror if you tried to stick one on their dinner plate. I mean, all of this said, I'm not an advocate that we should be going out collecting wild insects and eating them, because there aren't enough of them, and they can't afford to be harvested. One more thing going on, but there is a case to be made, maybe for breeding insects for food, because they basically they're really nutritious, and they're much more efficient at turning plant material that's inedible to us into juicy, protein-rich, fat-rich material that's really good for us. They're much more efficient than the animals, the livestock we normally keep: pigs, cows, chickens, whatever. And they use far less water, and you can rear them in much less space. So things like crickets and mealworms and so on, may have real potential to help feed the world sustainably. And that said, I think actually the simpler solution is just to eat less meat. I'm not completely vegetarian, but if we could all scale back consumption of livestock, that statistic, 60% of the world's mammals are cows and pigs and sheep these days. Well, if we didn't eat so many, then there would be fewer of them. Maybe that sounds counterintuitive, but it's true. And it's a really inefficient way to feed the world's population, the amount of mammal and bird meat that we currently consume. So maybe a few more insects and a few more vegetables would be a much healthier diet.
Yeah, that's it. And I think it's also thinking about how you can utilize them in a way to support processes we're already involved with. So, for example, I've seen there's a type of mealworm that they're using to eat sort of polystyrene and things like that. I don't know if you've seen this.
No, I haven't.
Yeah, there's a type of I'm sure it's a type of mealworm, some sort of grub, which can eat a certain type of plastic and break it down. So they're using that as a way to manage some types of plastic waste. Then there's another type which is which they can use very grimly to consume human waste, but because of the way their gut works, essentially it's inert, so you wouldn't want to, but you could in theory eat those insects after they've consumed that.
Tasty.
But what you could do is then feed those insects to livestock, for chickens for example, so you're kind of dealing with a waste problem and a food problem all in one, and making more sort of a tied up solution.
Well, I mean, certainly, human waste, we shouldn't be flushing it down the loo and then out to sea, essentially. Particularly the phosphates that we lose out into ocean sediments through that route, we can't get back. And ultimately, one day we'll run out of phosphates.
Right.
So it does seem that we should be looking for. I mean, and it is frustrating because these solutions do already exist usually, and if not, we're probably clever enough that we could come up with them fairly fast if we actually really tried.
That's it. We have an episode talking about worms with Ana de la Vega, who's a wormologist. And she talks about this a lot, about how we can use worms to access these nutrients that are being lost, and how we really need to rethink the whole waste system, basically. And it was incredibly interesting to find out about those solutions. And what I find most amazing is how a lot of them are so low tech. You know, you don't need these high-tech solutions, which are always what's sort of banded around as the solutions. Whereas actually a lot of it can be incredibly simple.
It seems to be human nature to think that there's a technical fix. What you said just reminds me of, you know, there's a lot of governments' strategy to reach net zero by 2050 or whenever it is that different governments are aiming for involves carbon capture, and basically involves relying on machines that we haven't invented to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which, you know, seems optimistic to say the least, that your strategy to save the planet involves inventing something we don't know how to invent and somehow finding a way of powering it, which isn't going to make the whole problem even worse by increasing the energy demand, when we have trees. And nature, you know, soils managed well can absorb carbon, trees can absorb carbon. We don't need a technical fix. We actually just need to be looking for a natural solution very often.
That's it, and a lot of it is taking existing processes and making them more efficient. That's a huge part of resolving this issue, of thinking about how we integrate trees within agricultural systems or whatever else it is. And as we move forward and we have hotter days like we've been experiencing, so we're filming this in July 2022. It was a couple of days ago was so far the hottest day, where it reached 40 degrees and parts of London caught fire, which is crazy. And we know that crops struggle to survive in those temperatures. So we need to look at trees and things within agricultural systems to be able to tackle that. And that's something we'll come back to, because I know it's a part of the integrated pest management side of things as well. So we'll come back to that point, I think, because it's a really good one.
Sounds good.
I've just found a point here about the comparison between insects for food and livestock. So yeah, cows require 55 times as much water and 14 times as much space compared to crickets for the same biomass.
Yeah, it's a no-brainer, really, if we get desperate.
That's it. And while we're talking about the value insects can bring, I found this point really interesting. So it talks about the parasitic worms in the dung of animals in Australia. And it says here that essentially we're giving pesticides to animals to get rid of these parasites, which is affecting the dung beetles and things that are there, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
And it says, ironically, the parasitic treatments now given to cattle make their dung toxic to insects, which slows down the recycling of dung and exacerbates the very parasitic problem they're supposed to treat.
Yeah.
So because there's more dung present. And then it goes on to say, with each cow producing about a dozen cowpats per day, by the 1950s, the area of Australia covered by cowpats was estimated to be increasing by 2,000 square kilometres per year.
Yeah, so that requires a bit of an explanation. Basically, we obviously took cows to Australia. The native Australian mammals, the marsupials, obviously they produce dung, but it's really, really dry because they live in such arid conditions. They've evolved to waste very little water, and so the native Australian dung beetles are adapted to living in really dry dung, and cowpats are anything but. And so the Australian dung beetles basically drowned if they tried to do anything with a cowpat, which meant that basically just cowpats were not being disposed of by anything. And in the end, they had to introduce dung beetles that could deal with cowpats from South America and South Africa, and actually it worked amazingly well. And within a couple of years, the cowpats had all been neatly cleaned away by this army of dung beetles, and to this day they're doing the job. But it just goes to show, you know, I mean, who really thinks about dung beetles and the value of dung beetles? Nobody. We just took them for granted. But then, you know, in that one situation where they weren't there, you suddenly realise what an important job they've been doing.
That's it. When you're standing in dung, you start thinking, right, got to do something now.
Yeah. It sounds like fun.
Yeah, pretty grim. I hope you've enjoyed the episode so far. Here's a quick message from one of our sponsors. Make sustainability a priority throughout the design process with a suite of tools built specifically for landscape architecture and design. Vectorworks gives you the freedom to follow your imagination wherever it may lead. With remarkably flexible software that integrates BIM for landscape and GIS workflows, sketch, model, and document in a single tool with the world's most design-centric BIM solution. Discover Vectorworks' landmark and design without limits. Visit vectorworks.net to learn more. But that kind of brings us on neatly to the pesticide side of things as well, which is one of the things. I've got quite a lot of points I've picked up in the book here, which I found quite interesting, because this is one of the things I found most shocking through reading this book. Is just I could not believe the sort of issues posed by pesticides, the scale of the pesticide problem, and the sort of knock-on effects by it, because you just never hear about it. And we were discussing before the podcast a little bit just about, what we were going to sort of talk about while we're here. And essentially, we sort of discussed how they move through the landscape, which is something that really, really shocked me. Because, we talk so much about reducing the impact. We're using less pesticides than we've ever used before, but actually those pesticides are way more toxic and dangerous than they ever were. So some of them are way more powerful than DDT. DDT is banned, but some of the new ones are even more potent than DDT was, which is crazy.
Absolutely. Where do you start? Actually, it's such a big subject. I mean, people first became aware of the harm pesticides could do in 1962, 60 years ago, almost exactly, when Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, which is obviously where the title of Silent Earth comes from, or at least I'm kind of referring back to that book. And she wrote about the harm, particularly that DDT and its relatives were doing. And they were poisoning livestock, they were poisoning humans, they were wiping out birds of prey and any animal higher up the food chain because they bioaccumulated, and it was an awful, depressing tale. But at the time it was really controversial, and she came in for a lot of flack from the agrochemical industry, who said she was talking nonsense, when of course turns out she wasn't. And eventually the battle was won, and DDT and its relatives were all banned. And I think people thought we'd fixed the problem, and that modern pesticides went through some kind of more rigorous testing than they did back then, and we learned our lesson, and all was now fine. But actually, and I think I probably thought that, if I'd thought about it at all, until 10 years ago, when we got involved in studying it. But actually, when she wrote Silent Earth, there were 37 pesticides available to American farmers. Rachel Carson was American. Today, there are about 1,000 different active ingredients available to farmers in the United States, about 500 in Europe, I think. We have a slightly tighter regulatory system. And we keep finding that pesticides that have been in use for decades are doing huge environmental harm, and we withdraw them, we ban them. But all the time, new ones are appearing faster than anyone can test them, evaluate how safe they are. We have a regulatory system in Europe, which is supposed to weed out any really environmentally harmful pesticide from getting into the hands of farmers, but it just keeps failing. There are numerous examples of chemicals coming onto market, which it turns out often takes 20 or 30 years for the harm they're doing to be quantified. And for enough impetus to get behind a campaign to have those chemicals removed from the system, banned in some way. But all the time they're just being replaced by others. And I guess perhaps the most notorious example of this in recent decades has been the story of neonicotinoids, which are this class of insecticides that were invented in the 1990s. Got through all the regulatory tests. They're neurotoxins. They basically attack the brain of insects, and they're incredibly poisonous to insect life. DDT was an insecticide. Well, these neonicotinoids, 7,000 times more poisonous. So, just to illustrate how toxic they are, 1 teaspoon of a neonicotinoid is enough to kill 1.25 billion honeybees. The amount used on a single field of crop is enough to kill every honeybee in the United Kingdom several times over. And it turned out that these chemicals are systemic. They're quite persistent. They were mostly used as seed dressings. They were stuck on the seeds of crops. And when the farmer just bought losing my grasp of the English language, the farmer would just buy treated seeds. They were brightly coloured with dye, so he knew they were treated, and he just sowed them in the ground, didn't have to do anything else. And the idea was that the pesticide they're water soluble. They go in the moist ground, they would dissolve, and the little seedling would suck them up, and they spread through the tissue of the seedling and protect all parts of it from any kind of insect predator. Anything that tried to eat any part of it would die. And it sounds pretty neat, and so they were hugely popular, became and remain the most widely used pesticides in the world. They are now banned in Europe, but the problems were, and there were many, actually most of them didn't go into the crop at all. Usually more than 90% of them remained in the soil, contaminated the soil water. They could accumulate in soil because they're so long-lived that if a farmer used treated seed every year, the amount in the soil would build up. They would leach into streams and rivers. They were being taken up by the roots of hedgerow plants, so that the hedges were becoming toxic. Mm-hmm. Wildflower strips planted next to arable crops were all toxic, so bees visiting the pollen and nectar were getting poisoned. And they only need a few billionths of a gram of this stuff to kill them. So essentially the entire farmed landscape became, and to this day still is, permeated with these toxins. When this all came to light, and partly research we did and lots of other labs as well, eventually the European Union in 2018 banned them. But the rest of the world carries on using them, and because they're so persistent, they're still in soils. And actually, bizarrely, we're still allowed to use them. You can still drip them on your dog. So there's one of the most toxic of the neonicotinoids is a thing called imidacloprid, which vets still will give you to treat your dog for fleas. You drip it on the neck. And the dose you're supposed to put on a medium-sized dog is enough to kill 60 million honeybees or any other insect. And these are water soluble, and we've recently discovered that these chemicals are turning up in English rivers. Every river tested had flea treatments, insecticides in them, most of the time at doses higher than the safe limit for those chemicals. So yeah, it just goes on and on. If we were to ban neonicotinoids completely tomorrow all over the world, that would be great, but they'd just be replaced by something else. And they are being replaced by other chemicals. And until we break this dependence on chemical solutions, we're not going to solve the problem.
That's it. And I think I'll pick up a couple of points that back up what you're saying here, because I think the scale and the quantity is what was shocking. So I'm going to paraphrase some of this here. So within the UK, there's 4.7 million hectares of arable and horticultural land. So 4.7 million hectares in the UK. And we're currently spraying 74 million hectares in the UK, which essentially means each field is being treated 16 times. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Approximately.
Which is crazy. And that does not include, as you've already mentioned, pesticides used by farmers for veterinary purposes. Yeah. So that doesn't include treatments to dogs or any other farm animal.
Or council use in parks or domestic use in gardens.
Yeah.
So there's a lot more there. Although I guess arable farming and horticulture are probably the biggest uses. But yeah, it's a huge issue.
And then going on from that, it says here that bees can become addicted to pesticides as well, which leads to essentially these things accumulating in their hives, which then obviously you can see has a huge detrimental impact. So then it goes on to say, often levels found in colonies were far higher than found anywhere else, and it was found in a study in Scotland. I'm not sure if this is one of the ones you did. Mm-hmm. Which there was an 85% drop in the numbers of queens being produced in bumblebee nests due to neonicotinoid. I can't even say it. So how do you say it?
Neonics will do.
Neonics, okay, exposed to neonics. So a study had been done testing what 6 parts per billion would do to insects. Okay, you might have to help me out here. Which is considered an unrealistically high quantity of the pesticide in the natural environment. However, when a study was done in Sussex on farmland, they found that bees and nests commonly contained more than 30 parts per billion. So 6 parts per billion is considered unrealistically high. Yet in tests, nests were found to have 30 parts per billion. Then studies carried out in the Netherlands looking at fresh water found that there were concentrations up to 320 parts per billion in fresh water. And what's most terrifying about that is we're drinking that as well. It's getting into our drinking water.
The human health issues aspects of this are quite kind of disturbing, but we don't really understand them. It's the honest truth. But certainly we all consume these neonicotinoids. There was a recent study, which I don't think is in the book because it only came out a few months ago, where some Swiss scientists, they analysed the cerebrospinal fluid of children. They got some samples from children that were being treated for some reason. 100% of them had detectable amounts of neonicotinoids, neurotoxins in the cerebrospinal fluid of our children. Another recent study found that about 99.9% of German people had glyphosate herbicide in their urine. None of this is surprising because these we spray our food with them over and over again. The soils in our fields are all full of them. But you've got to wonder what the long-term health consequences are. I mean, glyphosate was said to, the World Health Organization labeled it a probable carcinogen, and there's pretty good evidence, disputed by the manufacturers, of course, that it causes non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Whether it does or it doesn't is hard to be certain because the industry does everything it can to confuse and confound the issue, so it's hard to get to the truth, even for scientists. But the reality is, basically, we are all exposed to a complicated cocktail of poisons that we've created in our food all the time and in our water. And we have no idea what the long-term, the lifetime consequences of that. It could be, many people firmly believe that things like Parkinson's disease, that probably a contributing factor is exposure to these neurotoxins, or that behavioral disorders in children, which seem to be becoming more common, may be attributable to exposure. The honest truth is, I don't think anybody knows, and it's really hard to find out because we've got no controls. You can't do experiments. You can't, take hundreds of people and allocate them to treatments and feed them pesticides or no pesticides or whatever for obvious reasons. And it would, to do that experiment anyway would be logistically impossible because there are so many different combinations of pesticides that we're exposed to.
That's what I was going to say next, and this is what really shocked me because whilst we do tests on individual pesticides, when they're combined together, they can potentially become much more dangerous. So it says here that fungicide and insecticide mixed together can be 1,000 times more toxic to bees than insecticide alone, which is terrifying. And I think in the episode we did with Anna that we've already mentioned, around the time we did that episode, there was a report came out about oranges, and then within an orange, so this is inside the bit you eat, the juicy bit, there's estimated to be on average 25 different pesticides within that.
Scary. Which
is crazy. So each of those may have been tested individually, but nobody knows what those 25 combined could be. And based on these studies on honeybees, just 2 of them mixed together could be 1,000 times more dangerous.
Yeah, and just to reiterate what you just said, so the regulatory process, which I've already criticised as kind of not up to scratch, it looks at each chemical on its own. It never looks at pairs of chemicals, let alone 15, 25 or whatever. And so a chemical that seems to be safe when organisms are just exposed to that may actually be much more harmful when you're exposed to that with something else. But we don't know in most cases because nobody's done the science, and the logistics of doing the science are prohibitive, really, because there are so many combinations to test.
Yeah,
there's really no end to, you'd be here for eternity trying to try them all out.
That's it. Yeah, and in what quantities and things as well. It's crazy. I mean, picking up, I just found there's so many good points through this book. It's really, honestly, I really found it very interesting. So it talks a bit about the impact on people. and how it's having especially big impacts on developing countries. Because quite often what happens is a pesticide that we know is incredibly harmful will get banned in the West, and then it gets flogged to the developing world, and they have much less regulations and control and protection against it. And then it ends up in rivers. So what they're finding is in some developing nations, there's a syndrome called blue baby syndrome, which is a potentially lethal condition in which pollutants bind to the hemoglobin in blood, which prevents it from carrying oxygen around the body. So basically, it's affecting children's and babies' ability to carry oxygen around the body. So they're dying from that, which is terrifying.
It's awful, isn't it? I came across an example quite recently of this same thing, that there's a herbicide called paraquat that was banned in Europe a couple of decades ago because it's basically really poisonous to people. You used to be able to buy it to use in your garden if you were so inclined when I was a kid, but it's now deemed far too dangerous because you only have to drink a drop or two by accident and it'll kill you. Not something to have in the garden shed, really. No. But we still manufacture it with a great big factory in Huddersfield that makes most of the world's paraquat. We just ship it to the third world and sell it to people who usually are using it with no knowledge of how poisonous it is, no training, no safety equipment. They may not even be able to read the labelling on the bottle. I mean, that just seems unbelievably irresponsible of us. If it's too dangerous for our own farmers to use, what
morally
the heck
corrupt,
are we?
really, isn't
exactly. It's obscene. And also neonicotinoids, which we were talking about a minute ago, they're banned in Europe, but we still make them in Europe.
Well, it brings me on to another point where here, I won't mention the organisation, but a very big organisation in the agricultural world globally was doing studies into the toxicity of these pesticides, and it found that only 2% out of is this right? Two of 52 studies found that it was toxic, essentially, to people. Yet independent studies found that 35 of 52 studies were having a significant impact on human health. So, in a percentage-wise, that's the companies producing these chemicals only showed a 2% risk or impact on people, whereas independent studies showed a 67% risk. And obviously these companies are the ones that have all the lobbying power.
Yeah. I mean, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and their tactics are very familiar from they've simply learned from the tobacco industry in the 20th century that the tobacco industry basically managed to maintain kind of plausible doubt over the link between smoking and cancer for about 50 years. I mean, there was evidence in the 1940s, but it was basically they cast doubt on it. They tried to criticize any evidence that linked smoking to cancer. They tried to undermine the credibility of scientists who published that data. They published their own studies, which is what we're talking about here, which seemed to show their chemicals were harmless, or in cigarettes were harmless. And they lobby secretly behind, in government, and probably lots of other tactics that we're unaware of. They'll ghostwrite studies for scientists. They pay scientists. It's a pretty sordid business. And there's a book called Merchants of Doubt, which describes all of this in the tobacco industry, and it's happening now. It's also happening in the fossil fuel industry. It's basically big industry's pretty good at looking after its own interests, and it's very organized, much more so than any environmental organization that might be arguing the opposite. And so, that particular chemical you were talking about, those studies were about glyphosate, which is incredibly controversial. It may or may not be banned in the near future in Europe because of this link to cancer, but it's hotly debated, and the company that produces it obviously disputes any harm. Equally, the companies that produce neonicotinoids fought tooth and nail to stop them being banned in Europe, and are now fighting tooth and nail to stop them being banned elsewhere in the world. But while doing so, you can bet your bottom dollar that they're developing the replacement, knowing that eventually they'll lose the battle. But as long as they can make a good profit selling those chemicals for 20 or 30 years, and they've got the replacement lined up as soon as it is banned, business is good.
That's it. And I think it's where we have to take, things into our own hands. So, for example, our landscape practice now is, making sure that we don't permit pesticides as part of any management activities on any sites that will be, looking after or writing management plans for into the future. We'll be looking at alternative methods. So,
Yeah, it's great.
which there are. And we used to use, heat treatments. There's all sorts of like there's electric probe things as well. I've seen lately to burn them as well, zappers and things. So there are solutions
we
to these things.
We absolutely don't need pesticides in gardens and urban areas. I mean, and if people are sceptical about that, look to France, where they basically banned the sale of pesticides to anyone who isn't a registered farmer, which means that local authorities and gardeners, homeowners can't buy them. And Paris still looks fine. It hasn't been overrun by giant dandelions and monster cockroaches or whatever. It's absolutely, it doesn't look any different. That was 2018 they did that. If Paris can be pesticide free, why can't London? Why can't every town, every garden? And there's, you can argue, I would dispute it, but there is a hot debate about whether pesticides are necessary to feed the world. I don't think they are, but you can make a stronger argument for that than you can for domestic use. There's just actually no need at all. We're sitting in a 2-acre garden which hasn't had any pesticides since I moved here 9 years ago. Admittedly, this bit does look quite overgrown, but over there's some beautiful flowers. Over there's loads of fruit and veg thriving. I don't use any pesticides, and I don't find I need them.
Well, that's it. I mean, and that brings us on to the next point, I suppose, is around integrated pest management. So how can we deal with these issues that we would normally tackle with pesticides and without them? So the other thing I think we should say, which we haven't mentioned, is what pesticides are, because a lot of people that I speak to think that pesticides relate to insects, but pesticides is like the family, and then everything falls within that. So it's anything you consider to be a pest. So that could be a weed, that could be an insect, that could be some fungi, it could be whatever, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people get confused because they think that herbicides are different to pesticides, but they're not. They are a subset of pesticides. So there's a number of this is a big subject. How do we reduce or replace pesticides? The first thing I'd point is that there's pretty good evidence that some of the pesticides currently used are completely useless. As in the farmer is getting no benefit most of the time from using them, and is actually probably wasting money. And the neonics are a case in point. There have been some big, very competently performed studies published in recent years showing that their use on soybean, for example, and their use on maize, 99% of the time results in no increase in yield at all. So farmers are wasting money using a pesticide because they've been advised. It's just marketing. If you read a farming magazine, it's full of adverts for pesticides. The agronomists who travel around giving advice to farmers, most of them work for pesticide companies. They're on commission. If your doctor was on commission with a pharmaceutical company, you wouldn't be very happy, but that's exactly what we put up with in farming. So the advice farmers get is always, spray this, spray that, and which is why we've ended up spraying each field 16 times, but probably quite a few of those sprays are not necessary. But dialing it back and doing the research to find out which ones we could easily do without is not something anyone wants to fund, unfortunately. So that's part of the solution. But also, when I was at university in the 1980s, I was taught about integrated pest management, which at the time was a reasonably new concept, and I think it dates back probably to the 60s or 70s, its origins. But it was hot stuff in the 80s, and everyone regarded it as the kind of, the gold standard for pest management. It's what everyone should be doing, and to this day, that is still the situation. Any scientist would tell you that we should be using IPM. And so what is IPM? it's actually slightly slippery to define, which is one of the problems, because it's basically treating the pesticide as the last resort. And there's a whole suite of alternatives, ways of reducing pest numbers, things like growing resistant crop varieties, crop rotations, so you leave the pests behind. You can use trap crops, which are super attractive to the crop. There are cultivational ways of killing some kinds of pests. There are lots of options there. And you basically, so to develop a good IPM program, you have to do some research, try out some of these different options, see which ones are most effective, and you also monitor the pest numbers. You count them, you get the farmer ideally to count them regularly, and you don't spray unless all of these things fail and the pests exceed an economic threshold whereby they're actually damaging the crop and it's economically sensible to do something. And if you did all of that, you could probably get rid of at least 90% of spray use. But it sounds sensible and attractive to most people, but it's completely against the interests of the companies that sell the pesticides. Because if the aim is to minimize sales of their product, and that is exactly what IPM tries to do, well, that's not going to do very well for the bottom line of a company that sells pesticides. So they have lobbied against the adoption of what I would regard as proper IPM for decades. And it's very difficult to break through and get it widely used in farming when all of the agronomists are advising farmers to spray. So it's frustrating. But that's where we are. I mean, actually, personally, I think it's probably the simplest solution is to promote organic, go all the way and just do away with the pesticides entirely, which does mean, on average, slightly lower yields. There's been some big global studies suggesting organic farming produces somewhere between 80 and 90% of the yield. So it's not actually that far behind, considering that's doing away with all the pesticides and all the artificial fertilizers. But at this point, people, the sort of pesticide lobby would say, well, we can't feed the world if we were to lose 10 or 20% of our harvest, or we'd have to clear more rainforests to grow that extra food. Actually, that's not true. I mean, nearly 80% of the world's farmland is devoted to animal production one way or another, and that's just a massively inefficient way of feeding people. If we ate less meat and we wasted less food, because we also waste a third of the food that's produced in the world, then actually we could easily feed everybody with the food we could produce without using any pesticides at all. I know I'm probably living in dreamland, I can't see it happening anytime soon. And unfortunately, there's a recent example of which is held up as why organic farming is bad. Sri Lanka, a couple of years ago, their president basically enforced everyone the whole country to go organic overnight because they were bankrupt and they couldn't afford to pay for pesticide and fertilizer imports. So he thought the solution was to just go organic, but he didn't give any warning of this strategy. And the poor farmers who were all used to using pesticides and fertilizers suddenly just had their supply cut off and had no training or knowledge of organic farming. And so there was a massive drop in crop yields. And lots of farmers went bankrupt. And that's now held up as an example. Well, organic farming doesn't work. And not done that way, it doesn't. But that doesn't mean it doesn't work, which is frustrating.
That's it. You see some examples that spring to mind, like companion planting and things like that, which work well on sort of a local level. For allotments or gardens and things like that, a bit trickier on larger agriculture, I think. But I've seen a lot of evidence, because my background's forestry originally, I've seen a lot of evidence for agroforestry and the benefit that can add by improving soil structure, reducing impact from the sun, which is especially important in the hot weather we're having now to help protect crops, increasing water retention in the soil, reducing erosion, increasing organic matter in the soil and bringing nutrients up from deeper into the soil. And all of those things, some of which seem contradictory because you think the tree would compete, which it does a little bit, but all of those things can boost the natural defenses of the crop, which means they can actually fight off potential pathogens. There's really good examples from Costa Rica, which I talk about a lot in other episodes. I won't talk about that here. But they found that fungi, for example, that are affecting coffee can basically be the fungi remains on the plants, but it isn't strong enough to overpower the plant's defenses when it's in that sort of system, because all of those things are better and it reduces stress on the plant. So that's an example I often hold up. And there's lots of other examples, especially from that you see in China, where they have sort of these big light traps where they catch insects and they eat the insects that they're catching, which are pests for their crops, or fish swimming in with the rice to eat pests within the rice paddies, and all this kind of thing. So there are, solutions you find in other cultures that are working quite well. And we used to have, my parents grow a lot of their own veg, and I remember they always had loads and loads of butterfly habitat, not butterfly, ladybird habitat that they put in ladybird houses around the garden, and they would release ladybirds every now and then if they had a big problem, to just help top the numbers up, to try and keep on top of black fly or whatever, or aphids, whatever it may be that's affecting the various crops they had there. So that's one of the ways they managed it, with sort of a natural system.
Yeah, I mean, you don't see generally huge outbreaks of pests in nature. They're a feature of big monoculture cropping, and I think there's pretty good evidence that this kind of route of huge fields with one crop in them is just not sustainable. It does huge damage to the soil when you harvest the whole lot and then leave a huge area bare. That's one of the reasons 40% of the world's soils are now badly degraded, and I think it only really works if you keep adding lots of chemicals to the system. Whereas natural systems with much more diversity seem to be much more stable. You don't get the pest outbreaks. There is always something with roots to hold the soil together. I completely agree. Agroforestry, I think, has a lot to offer, and systems like permaculture, which is a sort of overlapping way of farming, which basically involve agroforestry and permaculture and biodynamic farming, whatever you think of it, all involve growing a much higher diversity of crops and nothing on a huge scale. And some of them are perennial crops, so you've got trees, you've got shrubs, you've got flowering fruit bushes and so on. So there's always roots in the soil. You're always adding organic matter naturally. And the whole system is much more stable because you've always got populations of a whole diversity of predators. And it's actually, as you say, it's very like gardening. The reason I don't get aphid problems in my veggie patch is because I've got all these natural enemies there, because there are lots of other, they don't live on the crop all year round. There are lots of other plants for them to live in at other times of the year, which you don't have in the middle of a field of wheat.
That's it. The big challenge is around scale, though, isn't it? And that's the big challenge of how that's overcome. But as we see increasing levels of people with mental health issues, depression, and increasing unemployment in a lot of the Western world at the moment, you can look to some really good examples from I think it's Norway, where they've got these big farms which they encourage people to go to, a bit like our social prescribing here. They essentially have health farms where they send people to live on the farm for so many weeks. It's sort of a digital detox as well as a help in breaking depression. And then those people can grow their own crops, they can pick their own food, that kind of thing. There's a big resurgence of that. And there's also a big push in the UK now for retirement villages where, gardening really needs to be encouraged as a major part of that community because of the health benefits, due to increased activity gardening, because you actually burn a huge amount of calories gardening. I can't remember how many hundred it is per hour or whatever.
There was a Dutch study which showed that people with allotments were healthy in a whole suite of measures of health, physical health as well as mental health. They compared them to their immediate neighbours who didn't happen to have an allotment. And it raises all sorts of questions about whether it's the physical exercise, the social side of having an allotment, the healthy fruit and veg, which are often pesticide free, that you're harvesting, or some other more nebulous kind of benefit. But one way or another, being outdoors growing food seems to be good for us. And getting more people to do it seems like a sensible option, especially in these times of, when people are struggling to buy food in the shops. I would encourage everyone who's got the space to grow some of their own food.
Yeah, definitely. And we're not putting that forward as a solution to the food crisis, but it's part of the solution. It has to be, we have to get people reacquainted with growing food, more engaged in the natural world, more active and eating better quality food. And then some of these bigger systems like agroforestry and permaculture have a place to create food more effectively because they also produce more food per area than traditional farming with monocultures. So permaculture is great for urban environments and smaller projects. Sometimes it can be introduced on a large scale. I've been to a few places which do it on a larger scale. But agroforestry has the opportunity to do it on a much larger scale again, and obviously it's slightly less intensive the larger you get, because it has to be. So there are some interesting ways to try and start tackling these issues.
Yeah, I absolutely. I mean, a related issue we haven't talked about much is that we don't grow enough fruit and veg, both in the UK and globally, to give everyone a healthy diet. We produce, actually, there's plenty of food overall. Nobody starves because there isn't enough food. They starve because they can't afford it. But we overproduce, massively overproduce grains and oils in the world, and underproduce healthy fruit and veg. And you know, UK is a good example where we import about 70% of our fruits and veg, and yet much of that could be grown. We obviously couldn't grow avocados and so on, but an awful lot of stuff could be grown in the UK, but we don't. I would love to see, somehow in my kind of dream world, our cities surrounded by kind of human intensive small scale horticulture, things like, and there's a wonderful biodynamic farm near here, which grows a huge diversity of crops. It employs loads of people, 25 people on a small farm, which is, compared to a conventional farm, is
Crazy.
about 20 times as many. They sell it to local people through a farm shop. It's all pesticide free. There are butterflies everywhere. The soil is full of worms and dark and rich and healthy. They're doing something right. It's perfectly possible to grow lots of food on a fairly small area, but it does involve more people.
That's it, and I think that's where some technological solutions come in, like hydroponics and aquaponics, because they can play a really interesting role in reducing the amount of land that's required as well. You know, because I think it's if you take a large supermarket and were to convert something of that scale into a hydroponics farm, for example, then you can essentially take 700 acres of farmland out of use potentially, and rewild that,
Use
or whatever it is you do it
else,
else. And what's interesting is as well, one of the problems with hydroponics and aquaponics is it can't be considered organic, because it typically requires inorganic fertilizers to produce it. However, again, in our worm episode, we talk about wormiponics, which is where you introduce worms into the system, and you can actually use the worm castings like tea bags to introduce the nutrients.
The fertility.
Yeah. And you can use food waste from the system, and you can recycle all your food waste and things. So there are ways, again, around that to make it healthier, make it organic, and produce huge quantities of food within cities relatively easily. Because that's, as you say, that's a way of producing a lot of food in a small area. But there are these wider things that need to be addressed, like social cohesion, communities, which is something we've lost, social interaction, and people's understanding of food. So I think exactly as you say, I think having a lot of these areas where people can produce their own food, or in community groups or allotments or whatever it may be, coupled with these more intensive systems like hydroponics and aquaponics, you could really have a huge amount of food production within cities. And there's certainly space for it. I'm in Birmingham, and there's loads of derelict stuff everywhere. You could do a lot of these things really well there.
And most of our cities are on good fertile soil as well, where it hasn't been damaged, because that's naturally where civilization started. And people started living places where they could grow food. So it lends itself really well to producing food in and around cities, and obviously, reduces food miles, reconnects people with where food comes from. I'd love it if, kids could get more involved, if schools could maybe link up with these kind of farms.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that or the kids could learn how to grow food. I find it astonishing that we teach kids all sorts of esoteric stuff in schools, but we don't teach them how to grow a carrot. It seems like a bit of an oversight to me, because it's such a fundamental and also kind of a joyful experience, isn't it? Growing your own food. I mean, me and my wife still get excited digging up potatoes, because it's like Christmas, pulling this free food out.
You never
know
know what's there, and it's exciting to find.
Yeah, sometimes you're a bit disappointed by this little tiny potato, and other times you get a whole basket full. But
that's the joy of it, though, isn't it?
Yeah, it is indeed.
That's it. And I think that's a good, joyful point to end on, I think, because it can be quite depressing looking at these things. We've had we try and always talk about the positive things going on in the environmental world, and how actually we do have the solutions to everything, which you've clearly stated. There are a lot of solutions. We know how to deal with this problem. It's just we're not really getting on with it quickly enough. but I think that's a really nice point to end on, that, you know, there is this huge opportunity for people to get back involved with food production. We can reduce it. We know we've got the solutions, and it's just we need to crack on, really.
Yeah, it's getting enough people on board quickly enough. You know, the answers are there, but unfortunately, at the moment, not enough people are really engaged and willing to get involved. But
I think people are not aware of the scale of the problem.
yeah,
Because I mean, you know, again, I'm involved in the environmental world quite heavily. I didn't know as much that was going on with pesticides as I found out within this book. I know a fair bit about some of the issues affecting water and things, but I didn't realise quite the quantity, the toxicity, and the scale of the issue, as I did find out in here. And, you know, and the other thing that I've missed mentioning about this book, which is one of the things I really loved about it, is every chapter is separated by a piece about an insect.
weird and wonderful insects.
Weird and wonderful insects like the bombardier beetle,
Yeah.
which is just fantastic. And that was I was reading the book, waiting to get to those points just to find out a bit more about some of the beetles. That could be a new book idea for you, actually. You know, book on all the weird and wonderful insects and their unique characteristics.
Yeah,
Because
that
really,
has been
honestly, it was
suggested.
fascinating. It was really fascinating.
They were put in there, as I'm sure you could see, to kind of lighten it, to leaven the whole.
It worked really, really well.
Because there was a danger at times that, particularly when the chapters about declines, it's easy to get depressed. So, but there's some of the, I mean, the insect world is full of such amazing, weird creatures. Some of them quite dark and disturbing. The emerald cockroach wasp is a good example, but just fascinating. And there's so much more that we haven't even discovered yet. But plenty to keep me occupied anyway.
That's it. Well, how about, as a really light note to end on, would you mind giving us a couple of examples of, maybe not ones from the book, other ones, so people are encouraged to read the book to find out about all the other ones in there?
Oh, it's hard to know where to start, really. I'll give one from the book. Well, there could be any number from the book, and some of them are a bit involved. But one I think the first one actually is the femme fatale fireflies, which I find quite fascinating. Fireflies, these amazing insects, which sadly we don't have here, although we do have glowworms, which are close relatives. But the fireflies glow their bottoms while they're flying, which at night creates these little streaks like lightning at night, hence the name. And the females flash at a certain frequency to attract males of the right species, and the light is used by the male to hone in on the female. But there are some species of firefly where the females have evolved they can attract their own mates with the correct flash, but when they're hungry, they mimic the flash of a different male firefly and lure them in and eat them. So these poor males think they're gonna, get lucky, and instead they get eaten. But
That's one of the darker ones.
well, it kind of is, but I don't know. It makes me laugh.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a million species, as I say, that we know of. And every one of them seems to have some weird tale if you study it.
That's it. Yeah, I find it really fascinating. Like, I love I just mentioned the bombardier one, because I've heard of the bombardier beetle, but I never really knew a great deal about it. And it's how there's a story in there about how the gentleman's cataloguing it while it's in his mouth. And I won't mention any more, because it's a good thing to read the book about to find out why that's a terrible idea.
Indeed.
But I found the book really interesting, and it was incredibly refreshing, despite being quite dark in places about the issues we're facing. But the fact we have the solutions and finding out about all the different insects, I thought was really, really great.
Yeah, and the final quarter is all about the solutions.
It is, yeah. It ends on a very hopeful note.
There's a positive end.
There is. Well, if you want to find out the positive end, check out the book. And thank you so much for having us here. We've been lucky enough to film in your garden. Thank you so much for that.
I thought it was going to rain, but it's kept off.
I have felt a few spots.
It's been a pleasure.
But yeah, no, it's been a real pleasure. Wonderful to meet you, and wonderful to to see you here. And the fact you can spend some time with us is just fantastic.
No problem at all.
See you once you've written the next one.
I'm busy already. It's underway.
Brilliant. See you soon.
I really hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you're interested in finding out more about the threats chemicals pose to us in the natural world, then make sure to check out our episode with Merrick Denton Thompson, where we talk about ecology, landscapes, and the impact of farming. Don't forget to subscribe and share with friends and colleagues who might be interested. in this series, and a huge thank you to LinkedIn and its accelerator program for making this possible, as well as our kind supporters Dave Goulson Design, the Birmingham Botanical Gardens, and of course ND Landscape Architects and Monsterdon for powering this episode.